for the London Convention, Protocol and Ocean Affairs. And I'm delighted to say that we've got a distinguished lineup of speakers to talk to you today. And it's an honor for me to be introducing them. And together their presentations will provide us with an overview of how the work that we as staff and delegates here at the IMO fit into the overall governance of the ocean. And before we kick off, I'd just like to say that we are recording this webinar, and after each of the speaker, there may be time for one question. We've already had a few questions that have come in, so I'll be asking those, but certainly any of the attendees feel free to place any comments or questions in a chat. We might not have time to answer those, but we can certainly take those away and maybe respond to them afterwards. So that's great. So first of all, I'd like to invite the IMO Secretary General, Mr. Kitak Lim, to provide his opening remarks. And if I could ask everyone else to turn off their videos at the moment, I will hand the floor to you, Secretary General.
Thank you, moderators, and Honorable Baroness Patricia and Ambassador Mr. Peter Thompson, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, speakers, staff, and colleagues. It is a great pleasure for me to welcome you all to this webinar organized in celebration of the United Nations World Oceans Day, which was held on 8th June with the theme of the ocean, life and livelihoods. The oceans are home to hundreds of thousands of species. Marine ecosystems are essential for lives and livelihoods above sea level and far beyond the coastal zones. They are vital in regulating our climate and producing the oxygen we breathe. They provide us food, recreation, medicines, and much more. The oceans are, without a doubt, essential for humanity on so many levels. Therefore, it is paramount that we recognize that the health of our ocean is extremely linked with the health of our planet. We must preserve life on and underwater and ensure we build back more sustainably from the COVID-19 pandemic to protect life and livelihoods. Indeed, the importance of the shipping to the blue economy and sustainable development has never been more evident. As we continue to live through a global pandemic, I'm very proud that the shipping has continued to deliver, keeping world trading going despite the many thousands of seafarers being stranded at sea, working long beyond their contracted time. Today's webinar will highlight some of the issues and the high-level perspectives that the global community is facing in its efforts to sustainably use and manage our oceans. It is an excellent opportunity to present how IMO's work fits into the wider ocean governance regime. IMO has, in its more than 70 years history, developed and adopted mandatory rules, as well as recommendations and the guidelines to protect the ocean from the impact of shipping activities. You will be provided with the insight to the role of IMO, not only as a regulator of shipping, but as a part of the UN system and the ocean regulatory landscape to ensure sustainable and responsible governance of the oceans, and to support the work to implement Sustainable Development Goal SDG 14 to conserve and sustainably use the ocean, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. I must mention that IMO's efforts to reduce GHG emissions from ships, which is directly related to the UN SDG 13 on climate change, is also relevant to the ocean governance. Since the ocean and climate change are closely linked or cannot be separated. IMO last week adopted short-term measures aimed at the reduction of carbon intensity international shipping by at least 40% compared to 2008, in line with our initial GHG strategy, which will be important building blocks for further reduction measure. We will now focus on discussions on the mid and long-term measures to achieve the ambitious goal of at least 50% reduction of GHG emission by 2050. Distinguished delegates and colleagues, the protection of the marine environment and indeed the ambitions laid out in the SDGs is very much at the forefront of our work at IMO and in our family organization, World Maritime University, International Maritime Law Institute, IOPC Fund, and the INSO. I'm very happy this webinar will also highlight the importance work of these organizations and their contribution toward the attainment of our common objectives. As a result of the hard work and determination of the IMO member states over the decade, the industry has become safer, greener, and more secure. I'm convinced that through the endeavors of your delegation and the Secretariat, and indeed the wider UN system, that the work continues at the pace. As I believe will be evident after listening to today's excellent panel of speakers, the maritime industry, as one of the largest users of the ocean, has a critical role to play in the accomplishment of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and not least as the vital part of the ocean governance. With that, I hope you all enjoy today's event, the first in what will be a series of informative webinars on ocean matters. I look forward to continuing to work with you all to address the challenges and opportunities we face in achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Secretary General, for those welcoming remarks and certainly highlighting some of the actions that the IMO is taking to address climate change, and those actions are so intrinsically linked to the health of our oceans. So now it's a pleasure for me to invite our first speaker, who will set the scene with his introductory remarks. That is the UN Secretary General's Ambassador for the Ocean, Peter Thompson. And for most of you, he certainly doesn't need any introduction, but I will just say that since being appointed as the Special Envoy for the Ocean, Ambassador Thompson has been instrumental in driving the implementation of SDG 14, the UN Sustainable Development Agenda goal to conserve and sustainably use the resources of the ocean. So, Ambassador, over to you.
Well, thank you for those kind words. And Secretary General Kitak Lim and Secretary General Patricia Scotland and Dr. Zen Sun and Professor David Vousden, and ladies and gentlemen, warm greetings to everyone present. I've just returned from Monaco, where I went to represent the UN Secretary General at the centenary celebrations of the International Hydrographic Organization. In my meetings at the IHO's headquarters, and indeed in those with its next door neighbor on the Monaco waterfront, the IAEA Environment Laboratories, I was struck once more by the breadth of the UN system and the high caliber of its human resources. What I said in my keynote speech at the IHO's centenary is equally true of IMO. I said there that together with its sister organizations, the IMO, WMO, and IOC UNESCO, the International Hydrographic Organization stands as an enduring proof positive of the benefits of multilateralism and international cooperation. Your organizations are the trusted hands that guide those out on the great ocean through stormy seas to the safety of the harbors they seek. And over the years, through your diligent processes, establishing universal standards and provision of agreed best practices, you've saved countless lives and boundless commerce. And so on behalf of the United Nations and the seafarers of this world, I give thanks to you all, whether you're responsible for predicting the weather like WMO, charting the seas like IHO, researching and observing marine conditions like IOC, or facilitating marine safety like the International Maritime Organization. The tireless pursuit of your mandates serves to better protect us all. Ladies and gentlemen, please forgive me if my words take on something of a somber tone, but I feel it is my duty in a specialist gathering such as this to repeat the remarks of the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, who announced at the Blue COP in Madrid that we are willfully destroying the life support systems of this planet. And in a more recent speech in New York on the state of the planet, declared that humanity has been at war with nature and that it's time for us to make peace. Turning to our relationship with the ocean, I would add to the Secretary General's words my daily mantra of no healthy planet without a healthy ocean, and the ocean's health is currently in decline. Ladies and gentlemen, to illustrate that decline, I point briefly to the wonder of coral. The IPCC has reported with a high degree of confidence that we will lose 70 to 90% of tropical coral reefs when global temperatures arrive at 1.5 degrees Celsius. Meanwhile, WMO reports that we are still on track for well over 3 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. Coming from an island ringed by a mighty coral reef, I, for one, on behalf of my grandchildren, refuse that future. The security of humanity on this planet may well be existentially linked to the fate of coral. Thus, we all have work to do. Ladies and gentlemen, over the decade ahead, we have a universally agreed blueprint to work to. I refer to the Paris Climate Agreement and the UN's 17 Sustainable Development Goals. If we implement these in full, we will indeed make peace with nature. As you well know, the 14th Sustainable Development Goal sets out to conserve and sustainably use the ocean's resources. It is sobering to consider at this advanced stage of the agenda that, like the other 16 goals, we're still behind the 8 ball when it comes to SDG 14's implementation. At the heart of SDG 14 is the sustainable blue economy. One thing that has become increasingly obvious as we endeavor to introduce a truly sustainable blue economy is that ocean science must be the foundation upon which this achievement is built. In that regard, it is an astounding situation when you consider that the ocean contains the majority of life on this planet, covers over 70% of the planet's surface, and produces over 50% of the planet's oxygen, that the majority of the ocean's properties remain unknown to science, and around 80% of the seafloor remains unsurveyed. We expect that deficit to be overcome now that the UN Decade of Ocean Science has been launched. I often point out that in the years ahead, we will have some very important decisions to make about our relationship with this planet. And we'll need to make those decisions on the basis of the most trustworthy and comprehensive scientific findings available. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is in this context of making peace with nature that I believe the International Maritime Organization assumes new and heightened responsibilities. All that I have said this morning rings the bell of an all-hands-on-deck alarm to avoid a planetary shipwreck. Between SDG 14.A's agreed target of increasing scientific knowledge, developing research capacity, and transferring marine technology, and the UN Decade of Ocean Science's aim of giving us the science we need for the ocean we want, there is much more that IMO can contribute to our great task of reversing the decline in which the ocean's health has been caught. I encourage you all to think about how IMO can better play its part in resetting humankind's relationship with the ocean. Everything and every one of us are connected. The COVID-19 pandemic has rammed that truth home. So let us consider our connection to shipping. Individual vessels of the global shipping fleet have their specific tasks and voyages to complete, but I believe each of them can also serve as agents of the UN Decade of Ocean Science. Such is the power of technology and connectivity today that with the same casual air with which we swipe our smartphones, ships' hulls should be transmitting a stream of information on acidification, oxygen levels, salinity, chemical composition, temperature, and plastic pollution of the waters around them to a universal hub. As I said in Monaco this week, for the ocean's digital twin that is envisaged by the UN Decade, we require the data for the science we need for the ocean we want. Mariners, seagoing cargoes, passengers, ship owners, and ports have more skin in the game than most when it comes to strengthening efforts to protect the ocean's well-being. So I urge them all, through IMO and its sister organizations, to get involved and ensure that the UN Decade of Ocean Science delivers on its high purpose for people and planet. Ladies and gentlemen, as the United Nations specialized agency with responsibility for the safety and security of shipping and the prevention of marine and atmospheric pollution by ships, the work of IMO has huge implications for the well-being of the ocean. I don't need to spell these out for you, but if there is one challenge that must be met without further prevarication, it is the transformation of shipping propulsion from fossil fuels to pollution-free renewable energy. I do not accept much of the hand-wringing that goes on regarding this transformation. It was not long ago that the transition from sail to steam propulsion took place. In fact, my family arrived in Fiji in the days of sailing ships. My great-great-grandfather was a master mariner, and he spent his life sailing back and forward from the Antipodes to the northern hemisphere. The transition to steam was made after he passed, and I dearly hope the transition away from bunker fuel will have happened before my time is up. Change is a constant. I have on many occasions in the past praised the IMO's initial strategy for reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from ships that was adopted back in 2018. But initial means what it says, and the world is waiting to hear what the innovative solutions are that will convert the global shipping fleet into an environmentally friendly, positive element in our struggle to establish a sustainable relationship with our planet. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to be speaking in the same event as the chair of GESAMP, the joint group of experts on the scientific aspects of marine environmental protection. I say that because in the UN system, my personal experience is that this is one of the most undervalued bodies of all. Many at the UN have never heard of GESAMP, and yet it is one of the most effective bodies at our disposal for the provision of scientific advice concerning the prevention, reduction, and control of the degradation of the marine environment. Whether it is the multiple deleterious effects on the ocean of our GHG emissions or the rampant anthropogenic pollution of the marine environment by excess nutrients, heavy metals, and discarded plastics with all their associated toxins, the ocean is approaching tipping points. As a purpose-built advisory body made up of specialist experts nominated by the relevant sponsoring agencies of the United Nations, GESAMP's contribution has never been more valuable, and I urge all concerned to strengthen GESAMP's hand and amplify its reporting. Secretaries General, ladies and gentlemen, in a year's time, we will gather at the UN Ocean Conference in Lisbon, co-hosted by the governments of Kenya and Portugal, to consider how we are faring with the implementation of SDG 14. I was in Lisbon earlier this month, meeting with the Portuguese authorities to discuss preparations for the conference. And as a result, I'm fully convinced that, like the first UN Ocean Conference, the Lisbon Conference will create a bright new chapter of action to restore and protect the ocean's well-being. Guided by principles of universal connectivity, equitable partnership, intergenerational justice, and planetary sustainability, I hope to see the IMO prominent in the mix of innovations and solutions that will be forthcoming from next year's UN Ocean Conference. And I thank you all for your very kind attention to my remarks.
Ambassador, thank you very much for those inspiring words and indeed at some point sobering words, particularly highlighting the importance of the work of the IMO and how that's intrinsically linked to this, say, to the health of the oceans, and very nicely introducing us to the topics that some of our speakers that are forthcoming will be talking about, indeed the blue economy and science particularly, but also that interconnected work of the agencies, particularly the IMO family as well of agencies. So very much we were delighted to have you in this webinar, and we thank you very much. Thank you, Ambassador. Now our next speaker I'm pleased to say is the Right Honourable Patricia Scotland QC, the Secretary General of the Commonwealth. In fact, she's the second Secretary General from the Caribbean, I understand, but also importantly, she's the very first woman to hold the position. And the Secretary General will tell us a little bit about why the ocean matters to us by giving us her perspectives on the ocean as part of the blue economy. So, Secretary General, over to you.
Thank you very much. And so, dear Secretary General, Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, friends, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. So greetings, everyone. It's really good to connect with you all and to see so many of you connected. I really value this opportunity to address you and to deepen our Commonwealth collaboration and partnership with the IMO, particularly on our shared areas of commitment and concern for ocean health and sustainable, inclusive, and equitable development of the blue economy. I offer my thanks to my comrade in arms, the IMO Secretary General, Kitak Lim, for kindly conveying to me the invitation to speak and for his valued engagement with us on these important topics. And I'm honoured to follow Ambassador Thompson and to echo his exhortations to us all to work even more closely together. In addressing so distinguished a maritime audience as this, it seems hardly necessary to rehearse again the importance of the ocean to the world in general or the Commonwealth, particularly in terms of connection, commerce, and conservation. We all share in both the benefits and the responsibilities for our ocean, which covers nearly 71% of our planet. It sustains most of the life-supporting environment on our planet, and humanity is absolutely dependent on it. Yet, of all the bounty nature offers us, the ocean is perhaps most undervalued, under-researched, and recklessly exploited. As well as supporting life, the ocean supports our livelihoods with 80% of global trade by volume and 70% by value being carried by maritime transport. In 2020, around 11 billion tons of goods were loaded in ports worldwide. 32% of the hydrocarbons extracted for energy to power our industries come from the ocean, and it provides for tourism in almost 200 countries and territories. The value of goods and services provided by coastal and marine environments to the global economy amount to a staggering $24 trillion per year. Yet we tend still to take it for granted, and much that we do continues actively to contribute to decline of this vital source of sustenance and support for human and planetary health and wholeness. Currently, over 90% of the world's fish stocks are used up, either fully exploited, overexploited, or depleted, whilst up to 200 million tons of plastic waste plague the marine environment. Climate change is warming and acidifying the ocean at unprecedented rates, and this is exerting enormous and unsustainable pressure on fragile ecosystems. At least half of all coral reefs have been devastated by bleaching events within the past 30 years. And it was right that Ambassador Thompson highlighted their very vibrancy as a touchstone for us, because this is really threatening the lives and livelihoods of billions that depend on the ocean daily, and the health and security of us all, including very directly and extremely threateningly for some of our most vulnerable Commonwealth jurisdictions. 1/3 of all humanity lives in the Commonwealth, in nations and territories spread across every continent and all ocean basins. Commonwealth countries are stewards of more than 1/3 of the global ocean under national jurisdiction and account for around 1/5 of global container traffic and 1/5 of major seaports. 32 of our members are small states and 25 are small island developing states. most of which have jurisdiction over ocean areas that far exceed their land area. On average, 96% of SIDS territory is ocean, and only 4% is land, which is why we prefer to call them large ocean states. For many of these and other countries, the ocean economy is the economy and source of livelihoods, income, and food for billions of people. Maritime transportation is the essential conduit for world trade, hence a driver of economic development for all of us. Provision of safe, secure shipping on cleaner seas has never been of greater importance than it is now. So in carrying forward from the Commonwealth Secretariat our long-standing programs of work alongside our member countries, areas of special focus are to provide assistance with revitalization of national maritime administrations and to support implementation of key IMO conventions and to build capacity through targeted training and upskilling. In this, we have been particularly impressive progress over recent years, with commitments being made by Commonwealth countries through the Commonwealth Blue Charter, adopted by our heads of government of all 54 of our member countries in 2018. Recognition is given in the Charter to the inescapable fact that reality, that most of the ocean challenges we face transcend national boundaries or interests and can only be addressed and successfully tackled through coordinated global effort. Of our 54 Commonwealth member countries, 47 have a marine coastline. Many of these are now becoming champions or members of the Commonwealth Blue Charter action groups, formed to find solutions to the most pressing challenges facing our member countries. To date, 16 countries have stepped forward to lead 10 action groups, covering a range of topics relevant to sustainable ocean development and conservation. There are Commonwealth Blue Charter action groups on coral reef protection and restoration, mangrove ecosystems and livelihoods, marine plastic pollution, marine protected areas, ocean acidification, ocean and climate change, ocean observation, sustainable aquaculture, and sustainable blue economies. But the last is, the 10th, sustainable coastal fisheries. In conjunction with the work on which these action groups engage, we now see the additional need to reset and rebuild equitable, resilient ocean economies in the wake of the devastating impacts caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. The economic and social turmoil resulting from the global pandemic and the continuing emergency of tackling climate change make it all the more urgent for us to accelerate progress towards coordinated action to protect and conserve the deteriorating ocean. These challenges combine to reinforce awareness of how connected we all are and how mutually reliant we are upon each other. One of the tragedies that we've seen, however, is that although we may all be facing the same storm, we're not necessarily in the same boat. And these difficulties underline the necessity for us to take decisive, joined up, cooperative, multilateral actions to protect our environment, particularly the ocean. As we begin, I trust and devoutly hope to turn the tide in the fight against this pandemic. We need also to gear up for the long road toward economic and environmental recovery. It is more critical than ever for our oceanic nations to manage their greatest natural resource sustainably and strategically. The combination and contribution of the global ocean economy has been projected to grow to more than $3 trillion by 2030, providing more than 40 million jobs worldwide. However, for this growth needs to be sustainable if it is not to further compromise our future prosperity and resilience to shocks. Interim targets to SDG 14 and indeed other maritime targets have mostly not been met. We need to redouble our efforts to ensure the sustainability of our blue economy, fight climate change, collaborate more, and commit to sharing and learning from each other. That is the purpose of the Commonwealth Blue Charter, and why the IMO and the Commonwealth are working so closely in cooperative, mutual support and partnership on ocean issues, from climate change to oil spills and plastic pollution, and as beacons of multilateral cooperation. As on other pressing issues in the past, Commonwealth member nations continue to join together in goodwill and mutual support towards a safer, more sustainable and more inclusive future, with progress and prosperity in which all can share. We do so recognizing that these are issues which no single country or entity can tackle or solve alone, and that the only way to overcome the colossal challenges which face us all is to work together. And we do so in hope and harmony for the health and health of all and for our common future. So thank you.
Thank you, Secretary General. And indeed, again, very inspiring words, and particularly picked up on the partnership. And you mentioned comrade in arms with our Secretary General, and we certainly very much look forward to continuing that cooperation into the future, indeed in a global effort to address the issues that you were talking about. One obviously highlighted the blue economy in your talk there, and the Commonwealth Secretariat has certainly been at the forefront of that, and significant advances in sustainable ocean development. But a question, if I may, in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic, that many vulnerable-based ocean economies, indeed you mentioned the 25 SIDS in the Commonwealth, or large ocean states, as we should be calling them now. Now they're likely to be some of the most severely impacted by the pandemic. So what do you see as their main priorities as we try and build back more sustainably? And what role do you see for the maritime sector?
And for Commonwealth countries, sustainability is central to the post-pandemic recovery, and the Commonwealth Blue Charter action groups are really focused on what this looks like across the blue economy. And within the blue economy, tourism has been particularly hard hit, particularly in many of our small states, where it makes up a very significant proportion of the economy. In some of our countries, it could be about 70% of their economy is based on tourism. But also the impacts on maritime trade and shipping has been really significant, and shipping is critical to the global economy. However, recent distribution bottlenecks and resulting global parts shortage have underlined how interconnected we are. And the pandemic has also highlighted the vulnerabilities of seafarers, with many being unable to return home for long periods due to the travel restrictions. So the recovery has to work equally for people, planet, and prosperity if it is to be truly sustainable. And building back better means actively planning to avoid status quo solutions that have left industries and the planet vulnerable during times of hardship. And seaports will remain economic lifelines in facilitating trade globally, but to use them as an engine of recovery, we need to regulate and address the challenge of rising freight rates, which are affecting trade recovery in many developing countries in Africa and the Caribbean. And for least developed countries and small states, improving ports and logistic performance through digitizing processes of trade at borders and adopting paperless trade can have huge benefits. And another example, I think, is the insurance rules, which will need to be made more flexible to allow the upgrading infrastructure and changed more sustainable approaches. And in shipping, for example, in order to reduce the sector's carbon footprint, some operators are already using higher efficiency, low noise propellers, and others are experimenting with hybrid sail vessels. So more solutions such as these are needed urgently, and it's up to us all to incentivize green innovation to speed up their adoption. And tackling unsustainable fishing practices, including improving the working conditions of fishermen, which is work being actively pursued by the IMO, the ILO, and the FAO. And other existing industries such as tourism and aquaculture will also need to accelerate their greening up if international commitments are to be met. There's masses for us to do. New and emerging industries such as marine renewable energy and carbon sequestration are needed in order to diversify, combat climate change, and build both economic, social, and environmental resistance. So this is just some of the highlights of the sort of innovation and diversification in the blue economy that are needed for sustainable recovery to build back better and to build back bluer. But I honestly think that the collaboration, the partnership that we're seeing now is really what's going to move us forward. And I said at the moment on COVID, we are in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat. But we need to make sure that the boat we craft is able to bring us all to safety. And we can't afford to leave anyone behind. And so I'm thrilled that we're not just talking, we're walking the talk. And I'm certainly committed, totally committed to doing anything we can in the Secretariat to support the IMO, to support our partners, to make sure we deliver on this. Because as Peter Thompson said, this is not just for us. This is for our children, our grandchildren. And if we want a world that's worth living, we have no choice. We've got to do it now.
Thank you, Secretary General. Yes, indeed, crafting that boat for our future generations. And we obviously all need to do that together. And I think you've just highlighted perfectly the work that the IMO is doing, but also what's in front of us and what we need to do, a call to arms, as it may sound like. Thank you very much for your participation, and it's been a pleasure having you on this webinar today. Thank you. Now, so our next speaker is, ladies and gentlemen, Professor David Vousden, who is the chair of the Joint Group of Experts on the Scientific Aspects of Marine Environmental Protection, or GSAMP, as we know it. And as most of you may know, GSAMP has a dedicated office here in the Marine Environment Division. And David's going to provide us his perspectives on the state of the ocean and why particularly science has a role to play in decision and policy making. Now, Professor Vousden has a career spanning over 30 years, during which he has worked in various governmental and United Nations positions, all related to environmental management. And he's provided expert advice and professional evaluation services to marine ecosystem management and ocean governance initiatives in every global ocean and in many of the world's seas. So it's a pleasure to hand over to you, David, to share your words and your presentation.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me okay, Andrew? Excellent, good.
Loud and clear.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, etc. Secretaries General, ambassadors, distinguished guests, and other speakers. Some powerful speeches to follow. We've had a grim description of the reality we face, but equally important inspirational messages, I think, too. I hope to show some signposts and positive steps for moving forward. Now, having a bit of a professorial background, I do like to give visual presentations, so I'm going to bring up a PowerPoint here through share screen, if you will just bear with me. And there. Can you see that, Andrew, and everybody else?
That's perfect. We can see that clearly.
Excellent. Okay, so what I'm going to talk to you about is the state of the ocean and the role of science in policy making, which is rather a large area, but I'll try and cover it in the 15 minutes. Yes, so I'm David Vousden. I am the chair of GISAM, the joint group of experts on the scientific aspects of marine environmental protection, and I'll be telling you a little bit more about that as we move forward. We've had some good introductions on the importance of the ocean. But I'm just going to reset that so that we have the lead in to what I want to say. As you're probably aware, more than 50% of the oxygen we breathe comes from the ocean. And the ocean absorbs 30% of the carbon dioxide emissions and stores some 16 times more carbon in it than the terrestrial biosphere. Ocean atmosphere interactions regulate the Earth's climate, and that's critically important to remember. Changes in seawater density and circulation can indeed affect shipping routes and shipping times, as I'm sure a lot of our colleagues in IMO are aware. The human consumption of fish is growing day by day, while between 70 to 90% of fish stocks are now fully exploited or overexploited, depending which data you consider. We do get many of our medicinal products from the ocean, including those for cancer and Alzheimer's and heart disease, the treatment thereof. Important statement by World Wildlife Fund in 2015 in their report on reviving the ocean economy, the case for action, states that goods and services, as I believe Secretary General Patricia Scotland mentioned, amount to about 2.5 trillion each year from coastal marine environments, but the report also points out that this figure is now dwindling, which is somewhat worrying, as I'm sure you can imagine. If we look very briefly at the main threats to the world's ocean basins and their causes, and I say very briefly because there's an awful lot of information in behind this. Climate change obviously stands out right at the front. Greenhouse gas emissions, fossil fuels, therefore causing that, deforestation and intensive agriculture, farming, producing methane and nitrous oxides, which are actually far worse greenhouse gases than carbon or carbon dioxide. Pollution in its three forms: land-based, nutrient runoff, waste materials, plastics, runoff from agriculture, sewage and aquaculture. From marine-based sources, of course, you've got hazardous substances, both chronic and acute. You're all, I'm sure, very well aware of what happened off Sri Lanka recently with the ship that caught fire and released a lot of hazardous substances into the ocean, some of which we don't even know what they are. Ship's garbage, fishing gear, and then we mustn't overlook the atmospheric contribution to pollution, and it's something that GISAM has been working on and has come up with some very interesting and unfortunately worrying figures about how much of pollution comes from the atmosphere. The obvious one being in terms of acidification, again, carbon emissions being the culprit, where we're getting carbonic acid being formed with rain, which is altering the pH in the oceans. Nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus, and various microplastics, which often carry toxins with them. Habitat degradation, as we know, coastal and offshore development is changing the coastal habitat and the offshore habitat for those species that live there. And indeed mining, both sand and seabed mining. Sand mining has become a major issue around the world now as far as habitat degradation is concerned, and bottom fishing, trawling. The mortality of species and disruption of food chains. Overfishing, we're aware of, entanglement from lost fishing gear, plastics and toxins being ingested by species, and disturbance of sensitive areas. And then invasive species, something very close to IMO's heart, I think, from their ballast water and their hull fouling projects. This is still a problem. Escaped or introduced species. For one example, I suppose, would be lionfish, which have been accidentally, or you could say deliberately, introduced into places like the Caribbean, where they've been released from aquaria, and of course, huge problems. And then underwater noise is becoming quite an issue now, from shipping, from military sonar, and from seismic surveys for oil and gas. So that's just trying to set the picture for us a little bit. So what does this mean in terms of the actual trends and changes in the ocean at the global level? Well, We've seen deterioration in ocean health and welfare from rising sea levels and extreme weather events, from the increasing ocean acidification, changing salinity, which is altering water density, where the density of salt water means that it falls and creates different levels that different species can or cannot survive in. Decreases in dissolved oxygen and loss of sea ice from the polar regions, and indeed changing patterns in ocean circulations, which are affecting marine life and global climate. That was also something of interest to the IMO members, which I'll mention again later. Increases in marine plant life in areas as a result of rising nutrient pollution, reducing oxygen levels, and well, I think you're all aware of the issue we're having with Sargasso Blooms, which is a result of an increase in nutrient pollution. And growing levels of plastics and microplastics, which are causing significant impacts to marine life and humans. And this is something that GISAMP is working on very closely at the moment. But it's not all doom and gloom, and we should also realize that we are making positive steps. There are improvements in management tools and legislation, regionally, nationally, regionally, and across the globe. We have adopted a more ecosystem-based management approach to fisheries and to large marine ecosystems. And marine spatial planning has evolved significantly so that it's no longer just undertaken at a national level, but marine spatial planning now reaches out at the regional level through the regional seas programs, and indeed at the ecosystem level through the large marine ecosystem programs. There is a reduction of impacts from maritime trade and commerce. Again, IMO is to be, I think it's perfectly fair to say, congratulated on that with their various GLOW-X projects, GLOW fouling, GLOW meat, and GLOW ballast. Adoption of the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, of course, but as Ambassador Thompson said, as long as we actually manage to reach those 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, that's the important part. Improved understanding of the ocean's renewable goods and services. We are much more aware now of the value of the ocean's goods and services and why they need protecting. And improvements at regional levels in fisheries management and control of illegal, unreported and unregulated fisheries. And I'll mention that again briefly later. So if we then look at what are some of the needs, what are some of the gaps that we've identified in trying to address these issues, and some of the potential solutions as well, some of the constraints to effective management are clearly insufficient data and information for effective management purposes. We need more funding and more support for scientific studies focused on the main concerns and threats that have been identified. The Decade of Oceans is critically important to this, but the development of big data interactive platforms is also another area that is proving to be extremely valuable, and I won't discuss that in detail. By all means, you can Google big data and you'll find all the information you need there on what these interactive platforms achieve. The need for multiple value management. More and more, we're seeing that we need to evolve the ecosystem-based approach and adaptive management processes so they incorporate not just issues related to conservation and protection, but also socio-economic issues and the welfare of human beings. Inadequate capacity and resources. We need an increased focus on training at national and regional levels. Poor awareness and communication. We need better outreach, particularly from success stories. The Global Environment Facility has some really good success stories. Again, some of the best being some of the ones that IMO have been involved with in terms of GLOW fouling and GLOW ballast water treatment. Limited protection of sensitive marine areas. We need to establish more effective marine parks and special sensitive areas. And effective is an important word here. You can't put fences around the marine environment. And indeed, it's all very well saying, oh, we're going to declare a few thousand hectares or a few million hectares as a marine park. But is it actually doing what it's supposed to be doing? And is it interconnected? Are there corridors running between them? Or is it just sitting in isolation? So they need to be effective. Insufficient conservation of vulnerable marine life. Well, improvements in sustainable fisheries through innovative management mechanisms are the way forward. And again, I'll mention that very briefly in the next slide and the one after that. We need to translate and act on scientific findings, and this is a really important message that I'm going to keep reiterating over the next few minutes. We need a formally established review and guidance procedure under UN that actually takes the science out to where it's needed, and it's needed in so many places. So some examples of how adaptive management and policy making relies on science. Why is science important? Well, here's some examples for you. Electronic monitoring and reporting of fishing vessels, efforts and catches. In the Western and Central Pacific Ocean, we now have the only sustainable tuna fishery in the world and one of the lowest incidents of IUU fishing because of effective electronic monitoring and reporting and advances in predictive modeling. The GF International Waters LME projects, all of which undertake what they call a transboundary diagnostic analysis, which is a scientific analysis of the large marine ecosystems. That then translates into formally adopted and signed up to strategic ocean programs for joint management and policy adoption. And we've done this in 24 large marine ecosystems so far. The Bermuda Atlantic Time Series study in the Sargasso Sea has given us over 50 years of data, providing very clear evidence now of increases in surface temperature and acidity, and increases in upper ocean salinity. And then the independent scientific reviews of proposed ballast water treatment. This advises IMO on what treatment procedures can be authorized for use on global shipping. And I'm very proud to say that is something that GSAM provides to IMO. So what are the current UN global practices to improve scientific knowledge and understanding? Well, we have the World Ocean Assessment, which is the global mechanism for reviewing and monitoring the state of the marine environment and related socio-economic aspects. It's an essential process for identifying the priority areas for improving knowledge and focusing scientific efforts. Then, of course, as we all know, we have the recently launched UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. And the decade is the vehicle that the UN has adopted to address priorities and to develop strategies to reverse the cycle of decline in the ocean, and to gather the ocean stakeholders worldwide behind a common framework for sustainable development. And then, of course, we have GSAM, the joint group of experts on the scientific aspects of marine environmental protection. This is an independent body of experts that advises the UN system on both ongoing and newly arising marine environmental scientific issues. And it's supported by a secretariat based in IMO. These are three important, they're not the only UN global practices, but they are three of the most important. And if we look at those, we can see how complementary they are to the whole role of the scientific process. The first World Ocean Assessment, which was 6 years ago, warned that many areas of the ocean have been seriously degraded, mostly due to failure to deal with pressures caused by such human activities as fisheries, oil and gas exploration, pollution, etc., release of greenhouse gases. And then we had the second WOA, which was just 2 months ago, in fact, which unfortunately notes the situation has not improved much and that many of the benefits that the ocean provides to people are increasingly being undermined by human activities. If we move on then to the decade of ocean science, we can see that the decade is responding to some of these issues that have been raised by the World Ocean Assessment by recognizing the need for more efforts to go into ocean science, which can further support business operations, conservation and management activities, and coastal community welfare by predicting ocean hazards and by preventing and mitigating disaster risks. The decade is effectively aiming to support a participative and transformative process so that scientists, policymakers, managers, and service users can work together to ensure greater benefits for both the ocean ecosystem and for society. The decade will support that process. And we then move on to GSAM. GSAM provides an independent scientific review body that can monitor the risks, identify new ones, and advise the UN bodies and their member states of threats and impacts. Now, the current active membership is 15 permanent global experts, but they're supported by specialist scientists, up to 50 or more, on various working groups as and when they're required. As I said, GASAMP is supported by a secretariat within IMO, and we're very grateful to IMO for providing that facility. GASAMP also provides IMO with a formal review process through its task teams for reviewing ballast water management systems that are proposed by industry and disinfection byproducts for the bifouling management processes. And it also reviews exhaust gas cleaning system proposals. So GASAMP working groups are also having a direct focus on many of the SDG, particularly the SDG 14 issues. GASAMP produces regular reports. Here's one example that came out less than a year ago, the proceedings of the GASAMP International Workshop on Assessing the Risks associated with plastics and microplastics. And these reports are supported by the UN agencies that sponsor GASAMP. And here are the 10 UN agencies that are currently sponsoring GASAMP. And again, we're all very grateful that they support GASAMP in its work. But there is a missing link, and it's all about acting on these scientific findings. Now, we have the ability to find the areas of concern within the marine environment that need to be addressed through the World Ocean Assessments and the various State of the Ocean reports. We then have the mechanisms through the decade to prioritize and mobilize scientific investigation and knowledge capture to better understand the causes and effects of threats to the marine environment that these assessments and reviews have identified. We then have the means through GASAMP to carefully review the content and quality of the scientific findings and to monitor ongoing and any newly emerging concerns. However, what we are missing is a focus mechanism which, based on the findings and conclusions of these scientific studies and the information capture, can provide definitive and clear advice and guidance to senior management and policymakers on their options for action and response. So really, to draw this to a close, science in support of policy, what needs improvement? What do we need? The current shortfall can be summed up really quite simply: a means to provide clear advice and guidance to senior management and policymakers on their options for actions and responses. And the potential pathway that we're proposing for this is a mechanism to review emerging knowledge from scientific studies and define appropriate management and policy responses. A means to prioritize and provide support for further research and studies related to critically important and or emerging issues. A feedback mechanism to monitor the effects of adaptive management and policy responses. And very importantly, a process for distributing associated advice and guidance to senior management and policy representation at both the national and the regional level. And logically, this will be done through the existing UN agencies and bodies, such as those supporting GASAMP. So that's getting the advice and the information out there, not just to the regional bodies, but to the member states themselves. So forgive me for lecturing to you a little bit. I just felt that it was important to get those scientific aspects across and to make it clear where I feel that we need to move forward. And this is something we have been discussing in GASAMP for some time now. So to borrow the motto there from the decade, the science we need for the ocean we want, but I would add to that, what do we do with that science and how do we get it out to the people who need to act on it? So thank you very much for your support and for your patience. Back to you, Andrew. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor. And indeed, don't apologise for lecturing to us. I think it's nice to hear a lecture every now and again, particularly when it's on this subject, and you expertly highlighted the crucial role that science plays in ocean governance and the role of GASAMP. And indeed, Ambassador Thompson highlighted the role that GASAMP plays in the UN system. And you also emphasized the importance of translating scientific results and conclusions into guidance and advice for senior management and policymakers. So given your understanding of the state of the world's oceans today, what do you feel are the priority issues that policymakers need to focus on? And is there a growing role here for GASAMP in providing that support, do you think?
Well, the simple questions first. Okay, thank you. Priority issues. Well, let's break that down shortly into global, regional level and member state level. At the global, regional level, I would say mitigation of climate change stands out there. Obviously, through implementation of global agreements, that's got to be a high priority. This needs careful monitoring because words do not result in actions. I think some of you may have seen the IPCC reports that came out this morning that was supposed to come out later in the year, but was so critical and so extremely worrying, frightening, I would say. But for IMO, this means ensuring that the advances it has made already, the excellent advances it's made already in glow ballast, glow meep and glow fouling continue and are replicated. That's important, replicated globally. There needs to be some urgent focusing on resources to address the rapidly growing issue of plastics and microplastics entering the marine environment. And again, that's something that GSAMP is working on very hard. And of course, global fisheries, always there in the issue. Fisheries management is a critical issue. We are developing, though, I want to be positive as well as negative. We are developing very positive new management approaches, such as vessel day schemes, and some very innovative new tracking measures for identifying dark vessels that switch off their AIS in order to undertake, shall we say, nefarious activities. But these processes need to be transferred and replicated to some of the less successful fisheries areas. At the member state level, Andrew, adaptation to climate change, it's no longer just about mitigation, it's about adaptation. Countries need guidance on how to adapt to the changes that are coming their way in the context of weather extremes, changes in coastal and offshore conditions, and consequent alteration in access to fisheries. Again, projects like ballast water and hull fouling, management projects need to be replicated around the world, and countries are going to need assistance at the port state level to adopt and implement necessary actions and legislations. And also, I think there needs to be a clear mechanism for member states to request assistance and guidance on specific issues, or at least a realization that they can seek such assistance from the UN bodies and from GSAMP. To answer the second part of your question, do I see a greater role here for GSAMP? In principle, yes, I think there is a greater role for GSAMP. GSAMP has the expertise and many years of knowledge behind it to be able to take its review process of reports and studies and the findings, the conclusions and findings, and present some actual guidelines and advice to the UN bodies for them to share with their member states that focus specifically on options for taking action and for ongoing monitoring of areas of concern. And I focus on options. The one thing I've learned is don't tell ministers and senior managers what to do. Tell them what they can choose. They like options, and then give them their responsibility as decision makers to make the decisions. And I say in principle, GSAMP has a greater role because I'm acutely aware of the fact that GSAMP is a body of independent, voluntary scientific experts. And we already put substantial pressure on this group time-wise and in terms of workload. Nevertheless, I believe that a review and report coming out of GSAMP could have a final section in each case proposing options for management and policy action and for response without placing an undue amount of extra demand on the members. And I think GSAMP could also add to its agenda a specific agenda item in its annual sessions and intersessional meetings that could focus on management and policy actions, providing such options, but also importantly, monitoring whether they're being applied and if so, how successful they are. I think I've probably answered your question in quite a lot of detail.
I think you have. That's fantastic. Thank you, Professor, and it's been a pleasure having you in the webinar today, and we certainly look forward to future collaboration. As you know, we're intrinsically linked to GSAMP through the office here, so we'll look forward to that continued collaboration, and all the best to you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, our next speaker is Dr. Zhen Sun from the World Maritime University's Global Ocean Institute based in Malmö in Sweden. And she's going to provide us with an outline of how the ocean is currently governed and how the IMO, but also our fellow organizations fit into the web of actors in that ocean space. And Dr. Sun's main research interests include the law of the sea, international regulation of shipping, maritime security, and the protection of the marine environment. And prior to joining WNU, she was a research fellow at the Centre for International Law, the National University of Singapore. So it's my pleasure to welcome you, Dr. Sun. If you are ready to share your presentation, I will hand the floor to you.
Thanks, Andy, for the very kind introduction. Excellencies, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, good day to you. It is truly my privilege to be joining you at today's webinar. And I will join the panelists in discussing the role of IMO in the ocean governance from a legal perspective. As another scholar in the mix, bear with me, I have a presentation. So I start my presentation with 4 hypotheses. The first one being, as echoed by the president of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, Professor Tommy Cole, referring the convention to a constitution for the oceans. It provides the legal framework of all the activities taking place in the ocean space. As a constitution, it must be supplemented by detailed international rules and regulations to make it more effective. In the field of navigation, it is the International Maritime Organization that has been playing the role to fulfill the mandate of developing international rules and regulations. As all the speakers have mentioned today, we are looking at the ocean as a connected ecosystem that calling for integrated rather than fragmentation regulation to achieve a sustainable management of the oceans. And in order to fulfill any of these roles that we set out to do, we need the people to deliver the ocean that we want. I currently designed the presentation with 4 parts by giving you an overview of how the legal framework was set up in UNCLOS and highlighting the reference how IMO and its member state has been contributing to the ocean governance. In doing that, I would also like to highlight the elements relating to the human through capacity development, through research and education. I will conclude with reference to several of the ongoing issues that IMO has engaged in the context of ocean governance. When looking at the legal framework for the law of the sea, I would like to highlight 2 fundamental legal doctrines that guided the design of this legal framework. The first is land dominates the sea. It means for any state that intend to project any maritime claim will do so based on the piece of land. All the maritime claims will be measured from the baseline. As the map showing on the right-hand side, you can see we have man-made draw up those lines in the ocean space to divide the ocean space and the resources. The second is ongoing tension that is still visible in the current debate and all the negotiations relating to the ocean, is that the coastal states is trying to control as much as possible happening near shore versus the other states wanting to maintain the ocean for freedom of navigation, for freedom of access to marine resources. And those 2 guiding principles has been the highlights for designing the legal framework for the oceans. When we look at UNCLOS, which was negotiated in the 70s and took 9 years, we look at it from a historical perspective. It was at the back end of an international decolonization process, which a large number of newly independent states were seeking to secure their political and economic independence. For many of them, the international conventions, the UN Convention for the Law on the Law of the Sea, were the first time for them to participate in an international negotiation. And they consider that to be an opportunity to redistribute the ocean space and the resources. I'll pick the newly established concept in UNCLOS, the exclusive economic zone, as an example. I will refer to the then Ambassador Satyanandan, who was considered as architecture to design the maritime zone legal framework, is that to secure as much possible of the natural resources from the exclusive economic zone and the continental shelf to the coastal state. And they will be responsible to maintain the health of the ocean and to conserve and manage the natural resources within. UNCLOS currently have 168 states, including the EU. It has been supported and complemented by 94 seabed agreement, 95 fish stock agreement, as well as the current effort at the UN to negotiate an implementation instrument on the protection of biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. When we look at the legal framework, I would like to point out that the two approaches that have been taken within UNCLOS. The first is, as the map showed, that in responding to the state's claims, state has drawn the ocean into different maritime zones. Within those maritime zones, it allocated rights, obligation, and freedom to states according to the role they play, to have a clear defined maritime space that states knows how to fulfill their rights, how to fulfill their obligations and exercise their rights. And those three categories for state to have sovereignty over territorial sea, archipelagic waters, straits, and have sovereign rights over the living and non-living resources in the exclusive economic zone, continental shelf, and to have exclusive flag state jurisdiction for ships on the high seas. The second element of the legal framework is in responding to the connectivity of the ocean as a unified ecosystem, in dealing with issues that are of common concern and also have a cross-boundary effect. And those are the issues that relating to the health of the ocean, the protection of the marine environment, conservation of marine living resources, as well as activities that contribute to human understanding of the ocean, such as marine scientific research. So those are probably, if we consider it as both horizontal and vertical designing of the legal framework. For all aspects of these two elements, there is a ship coming into play, because that is the entity that will support all the activities that carry on at the ocean space. So that's where we look at the maritime side. IMO, or then IMCO, Intergovernmental Consultative Organization, predates UNCLOS. And it also has in place in the 70s already negotiated the draft MAPO, SOLAS, and even the COREX regulations. IMO's representative participated in the negotiation that lead to UNCLOS. The general understanding back then was, instead of trying to negotiate with detailed regulations and standards for all activities at sea, it will do so by incorporating the existing international agreement and making reference to subsequently agreed international conventions into UNCLOS. So through the rule of reference, state obligation will always be supported by the current development of the international rules and regulations. Across all the texts of UNCLOS, there's only one direct reference to IMO, and that appeared in the Annex 8 on special arbitration, recognizing IMO's mandate in the field of navigation, including pollution from vessels and by dumping. There are a large number of provisions in UNCLOS refers to the work done by IMO. I'll use the vessel source pollution as an example. UNCLOS lay down a general obligation for all states to protect and preserve the marine environment, including taking measures to prevent, reduce, and control vessel source pollution. Instead of incorporating or discussing detailed rules on discharge standard or drawing up protected areas, it refers states to act through competent international organization and general diplomatic conference to develop international rules and standards to manage vessel source pollution. And right now it is the most comprehensive MAPO convention and the 6 annexes. Once this international rules and standards become generally accepted, it will be binding on all UNCLOS parties. it will be the bar for states to fulfill their obligation as flag state, or to exercise jurisdiction over foreign flag states as port state or coastal state. So, as I mentioned, IMO's mandate under UNCLOS is to become the competent international organization in the field of navigation. IMO has fulfilled that role by becoming the global standard setting authority to develop almost all aspects relating to international shipping. If we look back through history, the 1948 IMO Convention has compared to now, a rather limited focus on safety and vessel source pollution. But right now we have seen a growing trend of IMO's work. It has included security and also other aspects relating to the shipping. So when we see whether IMO has fulfilled its mandate, I would like to draw your attention to both the lawmaking process as well as the implementation process. As we all know, IMO has over 50 binding conventions that touching on safety, security, environmental performance of ships. And it probably has almost 1,000 non-binding instruments to support the implementation and also to provide guiding principles and promote good practice for shipping industries and for the port state for state members to comply with the binding conventions. The second element is relating to the effectiveness of these conventions. Those IMO rules and standards would only be effective if member states can comply to them, can implement them. This is one of the unique features that under the IMO is that instead of focusing on liability or responsibility for states to fulfill their legal obligations, IMO has done so by identifying the need to promote state performance. IMO has done so perhaps since the 1970s on improving flag state performance. It has also introduced the concept of port state control. Now, port state control measure has been incorporated in nearly all of the technical conventions under the IMO conventions, and it can be applied to even non-member states. So those are the measures that IMO has been focusing on by improving the capacity of member states to comply and implement those conventions and legal obligations. The second element to support the implementation is the technical cooperation program. If for some of us more familiar with the Law of the Sea Convention, there is dedicated provision on capacity development, transfer of technology, but across all sectors related to ocean governance, I perhaps would say IMO is a successful example on providing a mature program to support capacity building and the transfer of technology. It is a wide range of activities taking place under the IMO. And I want to highlight the element in supporting research and education. In the 80s, that recognizing the need for promoting human element, the human resources, IMO established two education and research entities. One is the World Maritime University, where I am, and the second is the International Maritime Law Institute in Malta. Over the past 30-some years, both entities has had over 6,000 alumni and trainees that coming from over 170 countries. Many of them have been playing a major role in the maritime sector, either in their domestic government agencies, international organizations, and as well as some of the research institutes at WMU, such as WMU. If I may make two observations, both institutes has a dedicated mandate to promote capacity development from less advantaged regions. And over the years, both entities has adopted their education program to be more suitable, integrating a broader range of ocean-related matters. Just to showcase some of the ocean-related research at WMU, in recognizing the need for a broadened mandate with support from the Nippon Foundation, the government from Sweden, Canada, Germany, just to name a few, WMU established the Sasikawa Global Ocean Institute. And with support, we currently have 4 programs at the Institute. We have 12 PhD candidates, 3 postdoc research fellows. We have, among cross different sectors, have established working relationship with a number of UN entities. For example, with IMO, we have on the marine debris program that we're collaborating with the working group dealing with marine litter issue at IMO. If I have 1 minute to share one of the programs that undertaken at WMU, that would be empowering women for the UN Decade of Ocean Science. We currently have a specific focus, but the research team also believe the research findings, the proposed action plan, as well as the strategy would have a transformative effect, can be applied to other fields of ocean affairs. This is also in line with IMO's gender program that on empowering women in the maritime sector. This program has recently been endorsed by IOC UNESCO as a decade action. In responding to David's presentation on calling for the science we need for the ocean we want, we would present or champion for promoting the people we need to deliver the ocean we want. To conclude, I will just touch on a couple of issues that IMO has been engaged in, both among its member states as well as in collaboration with other UN entities and international forum. I think as the past week's MEPC negotiation demonstrated, it takes a lot of time and commitment to make progress. If I may conclude with a positive note, that IMO has provided a forum for its member states to reach agreement and to deliver results that contributed to the sustainable management of our oceans, particularly in the shipping sector. With that, I thank you for your attention, and I will stop sharing. Thank you. Over to you, Andy.
Thank you, Dr. Sun, and thank you very much for that presentation, and certainly ending on that real positive note about the work of the IMO. One thing I'm interested in is in your role at WMU when you are obviously lecturing to undergraduates and postgraduates, many of whom will move into national and international careers in the public administration of maritime affairs and ocean governance. And in fact, I'm sure there's many members of the audience, people who are listening in today, who are graduates from WMU. As you know, our Secretary General is one of them. But I wanted to ask you, given the important role that they will play in achieving the SDGs and fulfilling the vision of the IMO and indeed WMU regarding sustainable shipping on cleaner oceans, if there were 1 or 2 key messages that you would give to your graduates when they return to their home countries, what would they be?
Thanks, Andy. I think I'll take 2. One is the observation that also being highlighted by all the speakers today is that the ocean is a connected ecosystem. It calls for joint multilateral collaboration. That collaboration not only taking place on the international level, it also from domestic level. So as I understand, a lot of the government agencies sometimes do not have a completed transparent working relationship, or sometimes, let me put it this way, sometimes they are lacking understanding of each other's work. Let's take IOU fishing, for example. It takes collaboration between IMO, ILO, FAO, and all these different delegates responding to a national level. It means a different national agency responding for different tasks. So if we were to promote integrated ocean governance, that need to be happen on the ground. that need to happen on the national level. That's our future alumni that can sort of taking into consideration and to increase their interagency collaboration. So that's the first message. The second one is perhaps related to the program that I mentioned on empowering women, is that there is a hidden working force, probably not seen somewhere. And I think by identifying the qualified women that can contribute to the workforce, it will be a very positive contribution as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, and I certainly echo those comments. Thank you once again, Dr. Shen, and I'm sure we'll see you soon and be collaborating with you and WMU in the very near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So with that, our final speaker today is someone who I'm sure most of you will be familiar with, Mr. Frederick Harg, who is the head of the Office of the London Convention, Protocol and Ocean Affairs here at the IMO, who I might say is also a WMU graduate. And Mr. Harg is going to provide us with a brief overview of the work that we are currently doing on these issues in the IMO, and perhaps will provide a little bit of a nod to what the future holds. Over to you, Frederick.
Thank you, Andy, and good afternoon, Excellencies, delegates and colleagues. I will be quite brief, but I will put on one slide. See if this works now. Does that work, Andy?
Yes, we're seeing that. Perfect.
Yes. Okay, thank you. And what I intend to do in this final presentation today is to give just some examples on how we as an organization interface with these ongoing ocean processes through the work of IMO. And I will also say a few words about what lies ahead. Building on what the speakers today have already mentioned, the first thing I would like to emphasize is that the work of IMO doesn't happen in isolation from the other ongoing processes. First and foremost, we should remember that IMO is made up of its member states and observers, which are also part of the other ocean governance processes in other forums, ensuring consistency. But as a secretariat, IMO, as any other specialized agency and sectoral bodies, has its part to play in this complex puzzle. From an interagency perspective, there are several mechanisms that provide us with the opportunity to ensure the sharing of experiences and resources, promote coordination, and avoid duplication. The first, and perhaps the one that is most directly contributing to our regulatory work, is GASAMP, which the chair, Professor Vousden, introduced recently. IMO hosts the Secretariat for GASAMP, the GASAMP office here in MED, and has done so since the inception in the late 1960s. And as an independent body, GASAMP provides direct advice to IMO and its organs, mainly MEPC and the London Convention and Protocol. But GASAMP is also an important cooperation mechanism where the 10 sponsoring UN organizations come together to get scientific advice to support their respective mandates and to address issues of common interest. Outside of IMO itself, there is also UN Oceans, which is an interagency mechanism for enhancing coordination, coherence, and effectiveness of United Nations system organizations with competence in activities related to ocean and coastal areas. Today, UN Oceans consists of nearly 30 UN entities, and the Secretariat is based in the Division of the Oceans and the Law of the Sea, DUALOS, at the UN in New York. In addition, other UN cooperation mechanisms, such as the UN Environment Management Group, or UNEMG, also provide opportunities for exchange of information, sharing, and coordination, including on ocean-related matters, at least to some extent. Several speakers before me has mentioned that there are currently a number of intergovernmental processes of direct relevance to ocean governance, including the Intergovernmental Conference on Marine Biodiversity of Areas Beyond National Jurisdiction, or BBNJ for short, which is in its final stages of negotiating a new treaty. The decade ahead, until 2030, is a crucial point in time for the ocean, and the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development from 2021 to 2030, coordinated by IOC of UNESCO, is another important cooperation mechanism that IMO is participating in. And from the environmental perspective, the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework under the Convention on Biological Biodiversity, CBD, is yet another important process that links to all the other ones. An important part of our work is also the participation in the work of meetings of other organizations, such as UNEP and its United Nations Environment Assembly, the UNFCCC on climate change matters, FAO and its Committee on Fisheries, ILO, and many others. IMO participates in the states parties meetings of UNCLOS, as well as many other processes at the UN headquarters in New York, such as the informal consultative process on oceans and the law of the sea. Participating in these processes and events provides us with an opportunity to ensure that IMO's role in ocean governance is appreciated, and it allows us to stay abreast of developments on behalf of our member states. Consequently, the Secretariat provides regular updates on these issues to the committees and governing bodies here at IMO. Another important layer in the ocean governance, not least from an environmental perspective, is the regional level and the various bodies established regionally in MED, but also through other divisions, and not least our Technical Cooperation Division. We have a close cooperation with most, if not all, regional seas environmental conventions around the world. In all this, capacity building plays an important role. And as you may be aware, the ocean governance issues are high on the agenda in both IMLI and WMU. But it's also important to remember that all our technical cooperation activities play their part in building capacity to implement the globally agreed ocean governance framework at the national and international and regional levels. Within the Secretariat, several divisions and departments take part in these numerous ocean governance related processes, and sharing of information with each other is crucial. For many of these meetings and processes, the Office of the London Convention Protocol and Ocean Affairs acts as a focal point, but others are attended by other parts of MED, by the Executive Office of the Secretary General, the Legal and External Relations Division, Technical Cooperation Division, or the Maritime Safety Division, or other departments and divisions. So to improve the sharing of information internally, the ESG established an internal ocean task team with representatives from most divisions, coordinated by MED. In the last year, we have had several meetings to update each other on recent events, and this webinar is indeed an outcome of this initiative to further enhance our information sharing and dialogue. Additionally, we established an informal ocean group to share information between the IMO family organizations, WMU, IMLI, IPC funds, and IMSO. Due to the pandemic, many of the processes that we have discussed today have been delayed or postponed over the last year, but it is anticipated that the pace will pick up from next year. For example, the delayed fourth session of the BBNJ negotiations and the UN Ocean Conference to support SDG 14 have both been postponed and are now tentatively scheduled for 2022. We therefore thought that this webinar would be a timely opportunity to provide you an overview of some of those major ongoing processes from a few different perspectives. But we're also aware that this is merely a snapshot, a very brief snapshot of a very complex web of processes. So our intention is to convene further webinars during the remaining part of the year, focusing on some of the specific issues we have just briefly introduced today. These webinars will be more focused in details and may take the shape of invited lectures or more interactive sessions, depending on the topic. And we hope to carry out some of these with our colleagues in WMU, IMLI, IOPC funds, and IMSO as appropriate. We hope that you will find this useful. And with that, I hand back to you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, Frederick. And yes, and just thanks for highlighting some of those intergovernmental processes that are ongoing and highlighting how important that cooperation and information sharing is. So that brings us to the end of our list of speakers for today's webinar. I certainly hope you've found it insightful and it's provided you with an overview and a wider perspective of how the IMO's work does fit into that wider ocean context. It's certainly highlighted some of the challenges that we are facing, but also really emphasized the integral role that IMO plays in achieving the SDGs and how, as the Commonwealth Secretary General emphasized, how safe, secure shipping on cleaner seas has never been more important. So before we provide some closing remarks, I'd just like to say we would certainly like to hear any feedback that you have on today's webinar. And indeed, as Frederick mentioned, we will be having future webinars. So if you've got any suggestions for topics, please get in touch with us to our email olcp@imo.org, and we'll put that in the chat. And also, if you'd like either of the presentations sent to you that were provided today, we can do that. So with that, I would like to hand over to Mr. Hiro Yamada, who is the Director of the Marine Environment Division here at the IMO, just to say a few words and to close the meeting. And following that, we would just finally like to put an IMO video on that was developed to mark IMO Ocean Day. Over to you, Mr. Yamada.
Thank you, moderator. Excellencies, distinguished delegates or participants and colleagues, I'd like to thank the esteemed speakers kindly sharing their wealth of knowledge and views with us. Ambassador Peter Thompson, the Right Honourable Patricia Scotland QC, Professor David Vousden, Dr. Zen Sun. Your speeches and presentations were both informative and inspiring, and I believe the audience now have a much better understanding of the IMO's role in the governance, protection, and sustainable use of the ocean. Of course, I thank my staff in the Office for the London Convention and Protocol and Ocean Affairs, Frederick, Andy, and Jennifer, for arranging this timely and very important webinar for IMO just after our main committee meeting last week, MEPC 76 last week, as the SG mentioned. IMO's work is directly linked to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, as well as numerous intergovernmental processes. This is particularly evident if you look at our work to address climate change, marine plastic litter, biodiversity, and the prevention of all types of pollution at sea. This decade is important to protect our ocean. There are many good initiatives for this common goal under the UN system, governments, and private sectors. IMO has contributed to many of them through the UN Oceans, GPML, GESAMP, and of course with our family institutes and organizations, WMU, IMRI, IOPC Fund, and IMSO. We must act and tackle for the UN SDG 14 on the ocean, together with SDG 13 on climate change, which are closely linked. IMO has developed numerous mandatory international regulations to protect marine environment in a firm manner and implemented them with our member states. Today's webinar is our first in a series on ocean matters. We plan to continue and expand this series for wider audience so that IMO would be able to contribute more for the ocean governance. Specifically, IMO will further contribute to the finalization of the new instrument BBNJ and the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework under CBD. With that, I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to you all for taking the time to attend today's webinar. Thank you very much. Andy, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yamada. And yes, I'd certainly like to echo your thanks to the speakers, the distinguished speakers, and also indeed to everyone who has attended. And we sincerely look forward to the future webinars and you joining us for those. So with that, I would like to just put on the IMO Ocean Day video that was launched for launched for World Oceans Day during the UN Oceans Day event that took place on the 8th of June earlier this month. And apologies, we have run over very slightly, but I hope you can stay with us and just watch the video. And with that, I would like to say goodbye.
The oceans are home to hundreds of thousands of species, but they are also essential for lives and livelihoods above sea level. At any one time, 1 million seafarers are at work on ships. These men and women often go to sea for months at a time to transport the food we eat, the energy that keeps us warm, and the medicines that save lives. When they go home, their incomes sustain their families and wider communities. But when the pandemic struck, hundreds of thousands of seafarers were left stranded at sea and unable to go home. Far away from their loved ones for months beyond the end of their initial contracts, facing physical and mental exhaustion.
The longer you stay out there, the more fatigue you get physically. The hours start to add up. The weeks and months start to add up.
None of us signed up for that. We wanted to go to work, do our bit, and then come home. We didn't sign up for this sort of what felt like an unwanted prison sentence, an unjustified prison sentence.
IMO acted decisively. Our Seafarer Crisis Action Team directly helped hundreds of men and women return home safely, and we urged governments to facilitate crew changes. This is making a significant difference. As more countries responded to IMO's call, the number of stranded seafarers has gone down, from a peak of 400,000 in November 2020 to 200,000 in March 2021. And we continue to work with other UN agencies, such as the International Labour Organization, to ensure seafarers' rights are respected, allowing them to work safely and keep supply chains going for all of us. Seafarers are not the only ones to call the ocean their workplace. Across the world, millions of fishers rely on resources from the sea, but their profession is one of the most dangerous on the planet.
It's a matter of life and death, really, that over 20,000 people lose their lives at sea every year because of the unregulated state of the fishing industry.
To make the profession safer, IMO is supporting countries to ratify and implement a set of international rules on the safety of fishing vessels, known as the Cape Town Agreement. So far, around 50 states indicated their intention to ratify the treaty. When the agreement enters into force, it will improve the safety of life at sea and help fight illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing, therefore protecting the resources at the heart of those lives and livelihoods. To protect livelihoods above sea level in the long term, we need to preserve life underwater. IMO regulations have cut oil spills from ships and stopped ships from offloading plastic into the sea. IMO is also leading a series of projects to preserve the marine environment, protect biodiversity, and limit the spread of invasive species. 17 specific zones, known as particularly sensitive sea areas, have been designated by IMO. Ship routing measures have been specifically tailored to protect their fragile ecosystems and the livelihoods who depend on them. Only by protecting those habitats will we protect the roots and workplaces that the oceans make possible for all of us.